we're finishing up our discussion of the psychodynamic approach by talking about what we call defense mechanisms and what Freud referred to as ego defense mechanisms. So I need you to recall from the last video Freud's theory that there are these three components of the personality, right? There's the id, the destructive desires, the devil on one shoulder, right? Who's in constant conflict with the superego, which is the moral ideal. And it's the ego, or the conscious part of the self, right? The self that resides above the surface of consciousness, that's responsible for settling or mitigating the disputes between the id and the superego. So Freud said that, anxiety would develop in the ego from its inability to successfully resolve these disputes between the id and the ego and the superego, so that the ego will develop these unconscious behaviors in order to protect itself. And Freud referred to these as defense mechanisms. And for as much of Freud's theory that is very, unscientific, not scientifically proven, defense mechanisms are actually part of Freud's theory that there is quite a bit of research supporting. So the whole idea behind defense mechanisms is that they are employed in order to reduce or to redirect the anxiety that the ego is experiencing by distorting reality in some way. And we'll look at examples of defense mechanisms in a second. But Freud said these defense mechanisms are acting at a preconscious level, and that they only resolve problems temporarily. The underlying dispute between the id and the superego remains. So here are some examples of Freud's defense mechanisms. We'll start off by talking about repression. So repression is an unconscious forgetting. It's a way of forgetting where you're not even aware that the memory is being forgotten or being repressed. And I want you to contrast this with denial, which happens on a conscious level. So when we're experiencing denial, we'll consciously block out events from our awareness. Like if a situation is just too intense for us to handle, and so we refuse to accept it, that would be an example of denial. But repression, on the other hand, is happening on an unconscious level. Like if someone's in a traumatic accident and they have no memory at all for what they experience, or if they witness something traumatic and they have no memory at all for what they experienced, that may be an example of repression. Regression is when an individual will revert back to a previous developmental stage. So a child who is potty trained and then all of a sudden starts wetting the bed. Maybe parents are going through a divorce or they're experiencing some other big life changes and they start wetting the bed or something. That could be an example of regression. Displacement is something we've probably all experienced before. If you've ever taken out your anger on someone or who wasn't deserving, then you've experienced displacement. It's when we redirect our feelings from the original source to another target. So for example, if I have a really horrible day at work and I come home and I lash out at my kids or I lash out at my husband, that would be an example of displacement. Sublimation is taking an unacceptable impulse, something that society wouldn't find acceptable for us to express, and find a more acceptable way of acting it out. So if someone, had tendencies towards really aggressive behaviors or towards like sexual desires that society would find inappropriate, then they might, respectively engage in playing football as a way of expressing the aggressive drives, or throwing those sexual desires into artwork. I want to come back to reaction formation. Projection is something, again, maybe without even thinking about it, you've done before. When you accuse someone else of feeling the way that you feel because you feel as though your feelings are unacceptable. So if someone accuses their boyfriend or their girlfriend of cheating on them because they're actually the ones that have felt like doing the cheating, That would be an example of projection. Or saying to somebody in a moment where you're being like really difficult and really stubborn, saying to them like, you're being so difficult right now. You're being so stubborn. You're projecting onto them the way that you're feeling. And then rationalization, which is basically just making up excuses for our unacceptable thoughts and behaviors. So if I were to justify cheating on an exam by saying, well, everyone else cheats, that would be an example of rationalization. But let's talk for a second about reaction formation, because there's some really interesting research on reaction formation and homophobia. So reaction formation happens when an individual acts in the opposite way of their impulses because they believe that those impulses are unacceptable. I want to show you this quick video clip that discusses some research on homophobia specific to reaction formation.
People who have homophobic attitudes, who are more prejudiced or discriminatory against gay people, are themselves more likely to have a discrepancy between their unconscious attraction to same-sex partners and what they are consciously aware of. Those people who have such discrepancies, who really have a split between their unconscious attraction and what they consciously say about themselves, are more likely to come from authoritarian homes. If you're a parent who really strongly believes your child should be heterosexual, and then you use whatever means you can to convince them that they're only good and worthy if they are, this would be very controlling. This creates a lot of conflict in the child. And what we see in this study is one way that gets resolved is by then being discriminating or hateful towards gay and lesbian others. It may be that you yourself are divided between your homosexual and your heterosexual attractions, and therefore homosexual people feel more threatening to you, and then you express more negative attitudes toward them. We can ask people what their conscious attitude is towards sexual orientation. We say, are you gay or are you straight? But to get at their unconscious sexual attraction, we use a different kind of task. We use a reaction time measure. So we use this pretty split-second task where you have to classify homosexual and heterosexual words. And just before you're doing that classification, we're flashing the word me or other for some milliseconds just before they do that. And if they are non-consciously more homosexually oriented, they'll have a quicker reaction time when the words me and homosexual come together. Another way that we get at non-conscious attitudes towards sexual orientation is to use a task where people get to browse pictures of attractive men and attractive women, and we look to see whether they gravitate towards same-sex pictures or they gravitate toward other sex pictures. We've had a lot of anti-gay public figures who've been caught in same-sex encounters, and this study speaks to some of those kinds of cases that we've seen before. And in some of these public cases that we've had, it's really been someone who themselves has been homosexual, who's been publicly campaigning against homosexuality. And here you can see that one part of them is really fighting another part of themselves. Whenever somebody has a really intense feeling towards any out-group, but in this case, gays and lesbians, we ought to ask ourselves, why am I so concerned about that? Why is it so threatening to me? And one suggestion here is maybe one's own sexual orientation is a bit in question. And I think that we should raise doubts. Whenever we have those kind of strong feelings of hatred or discrimination towards other groups, we should wonder why.
I love that clip, especially the way that it ends. Saying, whenever we have strong feelings, especially feelings of hatred against any other group of people, we should ask ourselves, what does that say about me? Why on earth? Why would I feel that way? So, now that we're wrapping up defense mechanisms, here's a little practice for you to do. Charlie is a college freshman who's having difficulty transitioning to college life. They are spending most of their free time at the gym. They're in danger of losing their scholarship due to the low grades. They feel as though their professors don't like them, and they argue a lot with their roommates. Recently, they broke up with their boyfriend after realizing they were flirting with their roommate at a party. After perceiving. So now that we've wrapped up defense mechanisms, let's do a little bit of practice with it. Here's a scenario. Charlie is a college freshman who's having difficulty transitioning to college life. They're spending most of their free time at the gym. They're in danger of losing their scholarship due to low grades. They feel as though their professors don't like them, and they argue a lot with their roommates. Recently, they broke up with their boyfriend after perceiving that they were flirting with their roommate at a party. How might each of the following defense mechanisms explain Charlie's behavior? Projection, rationalization, sublimation, denial, and displacement. So you're going to apply each of those defense mechanisms to Charlie's situation.